Binding a quilt doesn't have to be stressful. There are so many different methods out there for binding a quilt. You could use one method to bind a quilt, or you could use parts from different methods to bind your quilt. There really is no one set way that you have to follow. In this video, I'm going to share my preferred method for binding a quilt. So here I have some of the cut off pieces from squaring up my quilt after quilting it. So I'm just going to cut this down into 2.5-inch strips to use for my binding. All right, so I have my first piece of fabric ready to cut, and I'm just going to square up one end of it so that I have a straight edge to cut my 2.5 inches from. All right, so now that I have a nice straight edge, I'm going to start measuring 2.5 inches so that I can get my strips. Now, 2.5 inches is just my preferred width. It gives me enough binding to work with so I can put the binding on stress-free. But if you're comfortable doing a thinner binding and that's what you like, go ahead and cut the width of strips that you prefer. I'm also going to straighten up the ends of my binding so that when I sew them together, they're nice and even. All right, so now I'm just going to sew my binding strips together end to end. Okay, so when I sew my strips together, I put them end to end, and be prepared to get upset with me, but I just sew a straight stitch across there, and I sew it a little bit wider than 1/4 inch. I don't do mitered or anything like that. I keep it simple. And I'm sure there's a lot of tricks to bring it together that way. And I know it's the right way to do it, but I don't. I don't like to. It stresses me out. It frustrates me, so I don't do it. Straight across, nice and simple. Then I take the strip that is on top and I fold it a little bit and lay it right side up. And I take the next strip, lay it right sides together, and sew straight across there, stress-free, not worrying about it at all. Then I take the top strip and I fold it over a little bit so that the right side is facing up. And I take my next strip, lay it right sides together, and I sew right across there. And then I just keep repeating that until I have all my strips sewn together, and I just happen to have one more here. And that's it. Now they're sewn together, and I just clip the threads to pull them apart. All right, so now I'm going to fold the binding in half and press it. So when I get to those seams, I just finger press it open and then press it really well. This is why I sewed it a little bit wider than 1/4 inch, because it just makes it a little easier to press it open. And then I just continue pressing the binding in half. If the binding is really long and starts getting in the way as I'm pressing it, I'll just start rolling it up so that it is a little more organized and contained. Making a quilt binding is relatively easy. I just would say it's not exactly fun. It's a little monotonous, a lot of pressing. So not really a fun step, but it's also a very important step. And the nice thing is it means you're almost done with your quilt. Just gonna keep pressing all this. It's kind of a lot of binding here. It's probably more than I really need, but I almost always make more than I really need. And I just save it, and sometimes I'll sew some of those pieces together for a scrappy binding for a scrappy quilt. The binding is all prepped and ready to go. I have my quilt ready, and it is time to sew the binding onto the quilt. I'm going to sew my binding onto the front of the quilt here. So I'm just lining up those raw edges of the binding right along the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to leave a bit of a tail so I can join the ends together when I get all the way around the quilt. I'm just going to stitch right along a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. And I have my stitch length set to just under 2 right now. I'm going to back stitch here. I have found that that helps a lot with not pulling out stitches when I'm bringing the binding ends together. I'm going to try to adjust the quilt a lot as I sew because the weight of the quilt as I move along can really pull and distort my stitches and the quilt, and I can risk breaking a needle if I don't carefully move the quilt along. I'm also going to stitch a little bit slower than I normally like to. I've noticed if I try to go too fast, it can really stretch the binding and make it a little bit wonky when I'm doing the final stitches as I flip the binding. As I get to the end of the quilt here, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the edge, and I'm going to stop sewing about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the quilt. I'll pivot the quilt about 45 degrees and then sew right to the corner of the quilt. So I'm going to raise the presser foot, my needle is down, I'm going to pivot the quilt, and I'm going to sew right to the corner. So let me show you how that looks. So you can see I was stitching straight along there, I stopped, left the needle down, pivoted, and sewed right to the corner of the quilt. So now I'm going to turn the entire quilt, and I have the edge that I have not yet sewn the binding onto facing me. I'll raise the binding up, press it. You can see I have a mitered corner there now, and then I'm going to lower the binding, fold it down so that the raw edge is right along the raw edge of the quilt. Press that so it stays, and then I'm just going to start sewing right along the edge. I'm going to start right up at the edge of the quilt. I'm going to be honest, I never really enjoyed sewing bindings on before. It was always really stressful to me. I never really liked doing it. It never turned out really nice. And then I just let go of having to put a binding on a certain way. I saw all these videos, or I would get all these comments about the right way to put a binding on a quilt, or I'd have comments telling me that I shouldn't do a straight seam when I bring them together, that I'm doing it wrong, that I should do it this way or that way. This is going to be the year of where I let go of all that, and I do quilting the way I enjoy quilting. And this is the way I enjoy putting on a binding. And now that I'm just doing it the way I enjoy, I feel so much better about it. It's not stressful anymore. So I really encourage you from this year on, from right now on, to quilt the way you want to quilt the way you enjoy quilting, and don't worry about what everyone else is telling you about how your quilt needs to be, how it needs to look, or how you need to bring it together. So I'm going to handle this edge the same way I did before. I'm going to sew about 1/4 inch away, leave the needle down, raise the presser foot, pivot, and sew to the edge. If you're new to quilting and you're a little bit worried about getting to 1/4 inch, you could mark it if you want to. I'm telling you, if you get pretty close to it being 1/4 inch, it works out just fine. But if you need it to look really precise, really good, you can always measure that out. So I'm going to fold the binding up and get that mitered look along here, press it, and then fold it down right along the edge of the quilt there. And then I'm going to start sewing along the next edge of the quilt. What step in the whole quilting process is your least favorite? I mean, what step do you not look forward to? I think mine would probably be basting the quilt at this point. It used to be binding. I've let go of that, so I need to find a way to let go of basting not being enjoyable to me. Every other part of quilting I love. I love picking out the fabric. I love pressing the fabric. I love, picking the pattern. I love cutting the pieces. I love sewing all the pieces together. I even love squaring up half square triangles and all of that. Love all of it. And binding, I'm fine with now. So I just need to find a way to enjoy basting. All right, so we're going to handle this corner the same way as before. Super easy. All right, so we're getting close to where we started sewing. So when I'm like a foot, 10 inches, 9 inches, just giving myself enough room to bring these ends together, I will stop sewing. And I back stitch as well, just so that I know that my stitches are secured and I don't have to worry about them coming undone when I bring the binding ends together. All right, so here is where the beauty of all of this comes in so nicely, so stress-free, is I'm just going to bring these ends together right here. So I'm going to line up the edge of my quilt on my ruler that's on here. If you don't have a ruler on your sewing machine table, you could just do this on a cutting mat, whatever. Okay, I'm going to trim off my binding that is all left over. I have a bit left over. Like I said, I'm going to save for scrappy binding. All right, so I'm going to pick somewhere in the middle of this. So probably around the 9 there is standing out for me. So I'm just going to trim at the 9. Let me make sure this actually overlaps there. It does. All right, so I'm going to trim at the 9 as straight as I can with my scissors. And you can see it's a little uneven. Everything's fine. This is stress-free. And then I'm just going to overlap this and trim a 1/2 inch away from the 9. That's it. Now we're just going to sew this together. So I'm going to open these binding tails up, lay them right sides together. And I'm just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across there. I'm going to actually sew a 1/4 inch seam this time because we brought these ends together with only a 1/2 inch overlap. If we cut more, we could sew a wider seam, but here we only did 1/2 inch, so we need to do a 1/4 inch seam. All right, and then I'm just gonna make sure I gave myself enough room through here, that there's no bunching or anything, and need to redo the seam in some way, make it thinner or wider if needed, but it's laying nice and flat. So I'm just going to finger press this open. You could press it with the iron if you want to. I'm just going to finger press it, fold it back, and then I'm going to sew over this open area of the binding. There we go. The hardest part of the binding, in my opinion, is now done. Okay, so for the final step, I choose to hand stitch my binding on. And I like this method the most because it is so hard for me to maneuver the edge of the quilt through my sewing machine nice and even to get straight, precise, beautiful stitches along the edge of my binding. If you would like to do it that way, by all means, it is definitely a preference to hand stitch or not. But I really like to hand stitch the binding onto the back of the quilt. So I'm just going to fold the binding to the back, and what I do is add a few clips along here. I don't clip the whole quilt at once. I don't glue the binding down. I feel like the glue just makes it too hard along the binding and it makes it harder for me to stitch it on. So I just add a few clips, just a few, and I move them as I sew. I found if I clip the whole quilt all the way around and I decide to sit on the couch and stitch it, like my feet will kick off clips, my hands will kick off clips as I move and adjust the quilt, and then I have to go searching for them. So I just do a few at a time and move them as I work. See, I just love how the binding looks on the front of the quilt without stitches along there that are seen with the machine. I just think it makes it look so clean, a nice, clean, beautiful way to finish a quilt. Again, it's just preference. So I have some thread on a needle here, and I double up my thread so that I don't pull my needle off the thread and have to rethread it. With it doubled up in a knot at the end, my needle stays nice and secure. Also, if I have to stop stitching, I don't have to worry about losing my needle as well. So it's just like a bonus there. So how I start this, and this is another thing where I don't think there's a right or a wrong way. It's just how I like to do it. I just start by sewing right through all the layers of the quilt here. I have a knot on the end and it's going to stop it. Just makes it really easy because it's going to get hidden in there anyway. And then I will just start sewing wherever that thread comes out. So I'll start just under the backing of the quilt, maybe through the batting a little, but I don't go through to the front of the quilt. So I just pick up a little bit of fabric there. And then I sew a little bit through the fold of the batting, maybe like 1/8 of an inch, no more than 1/4 of an inch, somewhere between there. And then I pick up a little bit of the back of the quilt, maybe through a little bit of batting, short, small stitches. So I'm using a thread color that more matches the accent on here. You can use whatever thread color you really want to because a lot of these stitches are going to be hidden. But if you want to, use a thread color that matches just to make sure that you don't see too much of this, that works too. So I just alternate between the binding fold and the back of the quilt, making sure not to go through the front of the quilt. Just small little stitches through here. I find it so relaxing. It's definitely not for everyone though. Like, I understand some people, it's hard to hold a needle for a long time. It can cramp up your hand. There's a lot of different factors that come into it. You just may not like it. There may not be a medical reason or anything. You just don't like it. It's not calming to you, and that is fine. I'm just showing the method that I like. So here's one of my seams in my binding. And I feel like, honestly, it just turns out looking just fine doing a straight seam. And, you know, I feel like there's no reason that I have to do a mitered seam there. It just looks fun. If your preference is to do that, then do it. But I feel like there's no necessary reason to, because it looks bad if you don't. So that is my preferred binding method for finishing a quilt. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.